Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan. My name is Martin Kölling. I'm first vice president of the club and the moderator of today. Before I start my introduction, I would remind all of you to switch off your cell phones or put it to manner mode out of courtesy to our guests. Yesterday, a landmark document was published, actually. We have it here. The report of the Parliamentary Investigation Commission of the nuclear accident in Fukushima. The document is outstanding in at least two regards. First, it's the document of the first parliamentary investigation panel of Japan. And secondly, it's straightforward. It's also a landmark document in its straightforward analysis, in my view. I can only recommend all of you to read the executive summary if you haven't done it so far. This report actually clearly carries the signature of today's guest, Kiyoshi Kurokawa. Thank you. Kurokawa-sensei is famous for delivering his opinion unseasoned and in a very straightforward manner. And because of his habit to speak his mind, many Japanese media also call him Maverick. It doesn't take much to be a maverick in Japan sometimes. But in his case, it didn't harm his career. After graduating from Tokyo University with an MD in medicine in 1962, he went to the States for almost 15 years. Before coming back, after coming back to Japan, he rose through the ranks, and from 2006 until 2008 also served as special advisor to the government, as a science advisor. And then, of course, maybe this report might be his final work.
Final.
For the community, and it's a very important one. Next to him, actually, we have Mr. Satoshi Ishibashi. He is a key member of the investigative panel and in his normal life, consultant for the financial industry. First, Mr. Kurokawa will now give a short speech of 50 minutes, and then I will open the floor to questions and answers. We have plenty of time, and I hope you have plenty of questions about the findings of his committee. Thank you very much. Please give our guest a very warm welcome.
Thank you. And thank you, Martin. And thanks to the FCCJ to giving us this opportunity. Good afternoon, everyone. I've come to FCCJ as soon as possible after the release of the report, that was yesterday, because it is important for us to give the global community a full and accurate account of what happened in Fukushima, which is really one of the major disasters, historical, and also have impacted to the rest of the world because it happened in Japan, which has its own pride in the technology and science and engineering. And I'd like to ask you for your assistance in getting the message out to the world. So we posted a report at the same time with our Japanese edition, but also the full text in English will be available in a month or so, and on the website too. I hope you've had a chance to read the English summary of the report, perhaps, because I'm not going to cover the full text today. Indeed, I'm going to focus on aspects that I think need explaining to the global audience, like you. And then I'm going to give you as much time as possible for questions and some key to the mysteries. Let me start with a few words on the Commission and its mandates. In fact, this is the Nuclear Accident Independent Investigation Commission is the first inquiry of this type in Japanese modern history, and creature of neither by the bureaucracy, the judiciary, or the cabinet. we have operated under direct mandate from the legislative branch, the both houses of the National Diet, and that is historical, in my view. As an inquiry by the people and for the people, as I said when was given this charge in December 8th, reminding them also this is the 70th year of Pearl Harbor to the Parliament. We are beholden to no one except the citizens of Japan. So in our findings, we have felt no pressure to cover anything up or to preserve the reputation of any person or organization. Guided by three core values, we made a statement, this is for people and the future and the world. What we presented is a complete and truthful account of what we learned about this Fukushima accident. That means Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant that was triggered by the earthquake, huge earthquake and huge tsunami of March 11th of last year. Our mandate was to determine what happened and why, and to recommend policies and measures to prevent future accidents and reduce the damage from this and future accidents. But let me make clear what we did not set out to do and what we have not done, because that was not the scope of mandate. It is not within our remit to draw conclusion about whether Japan or the world should continue to rely on nuclear power or not. And although we strongly criticize several organizations and people, the intent is not to blame or punish, but because when punishment becomes a focus, then it's often harder to find the truth. In determining what happened at Fukushima and why, our sole purpose is to ensure that an accident like this never occurs anywhere ever again, at our best. Nearly 16 months after the accident began, it is by no means over. The Fukushima nuclear plant remains fragile, seems stable, but significant risk remains, as you know. A vast area, almost 18 square kilometers, has radiation levels above 5 millisieverts per year and may be off the limit for decades. More than 150 people have lost their homes and livelihood. They continue to suffer immense trauma from this disaster, but because they are Japanese, they tend to suffer in silence, which doesn't make dramatic TV coverage anymore. So I encourage you to read the comments we received from more than 10,000 ordinary people in Fukushima who have been relocated and evacuated or forced to leave. And please quote them and let the world know how much they have suffered. There are certain figures in this text. But let me go back to the beginning. Although the nuclear accident was triggered by two natural major disasters, the earthquake and subsequent tsunami, it cannot be regarded as a natural disaster. In fact, it was profoundly man-made. In our view, Commission agreed, man-made disaster, as it was entirely foreseeable that a disaster of such magnitude might occur. The accident could have and also should have been prevented. Given the precedents available to TEPCO and METI and Japanese authorities, 3 Mile Island, for example, Chernobyl, 9/11, and Sanriku earthquake of 1896, they have no basis to claim as an excuse, therefore, that a natural disaster was beyond their assumptions or imagination. Fukushima Daiichi was not equipped to withstand an earthquake and tsunami of the magnitude experienced on March 11th, but it could and should have been possible. And however, TEPCO actively resisted implementing measures in response to lessons learned from 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl, and measures taken by other reactors operators around the world. Nor were TEPCO and government authorities prepared to respond to such an accident. At every step, we found negligence and ineptitude inside the plant and with the evacuation of local residents. If you read the report, we will find an extensive catalog of errors. But today, in front of the global media, I want to focus less on what happened, but rather more on why it happened. We owe the world an explanation. How could this happen in Japan? After all, we believe the world knows Japan for its high-tech engineering expertise. You know us for uncompromising commitment to quality and detail and perfectionistic obsessions. The truth is very painful to admit indeed to us, all Japanese, but it is difficult to grasp without an intimate understanding of how our society works. Perhaps you may have some feeling about it. That's why I'm making an effort to explain this to the global community, taking this opportunity as a first historical independent investigation commission mandated by the National Diet. This was a disaster made in Japan in a way, and its root causes stem from the ingrained conventions of Japanese culture, our reflexive obedience, our reluctance to question authority, our devotion to sticking with the program, our groupism, and our insularity. While it does not excuse those who bear responsibility for this accident, had other Japanese been in their shoes, the result may well have been the same. The accident stems from so-called mindset. That's also reflected in the report of 3 Mile Island, for example, and widely shared throughout Japan's nuclear industry and related government agencies. This mindset can be traced back perhaps in the 1970s, but perhaps rooted much earlier than that. But when the development of nuclear power was accelerated as a national priority following the so-called oil shocks in 1973 and 1979, once it acquired the exalted status of national priorities, a massive budget, and protected by the iron triangle, so-called, of politicians and bureaucrats and big businesses, nuclear power was beyond question. In our society, it is not done to question such fundamental matters. The only questions came from communities, usually poor and remote, that weren't sure they wanted a nuclear plant in the backyard. Many legislation and many processes to embrace them. But they were won over the financial benefits, for example, and continual assurance that nuclear power is inherently safe. So you don't need to worry. The safety of nuclear power became like a mantra for TEPCO and METI and the Japanese government, and repeated so often that they forgot that safety hinged on continual doubts and obsessive focus on what goes wrong. At Fukushima, this mindset reached a point where officials did not want to hold emergency drills for fear of raising doubts in the community about the safety of nuclear power, not limited to Fukushima, of course. Among also so-called elites in Japan, another dynamics was at work too. The expansion of nuclear power coincided with surging confidence in the superiority of Japanese engineering and economic and industry, and diminishing regard for anything not invented here. As a medical doctor by my background, trained at the elite University of Tokyo, but I've been surrounded by professional chauvinism all my working life. I know what it smells like, and I have been speaking out against it for the past 15 years after I returned for 15 years in the US in various academic institutions. I kind of felt awakened and be able to grasp and sense the reality and the affair of the world surrounding Japan. This is called, perhaps you know, the nuclear village, which is an accurate name for it because everyone in this elite knows each other, and like any Japanese social organization, it has a seniority-based single-track hierarchical structure. In any such group, you never disrupt the collective harmony by challenging the daisensei or elders of the tribe, because you go up the ladder on the single path since you came into organization fresh out of college. How you can have an impartial regulatory authority when it requires highly specialized knowledge and technology only found in such a tightly knit tribe of nuclear village? Impartial regulation would have been tough to achieve in the best of circumstances. But here in Japan, the regulation of nuclear power was entrusted to the same bureaucracy responsible for promoting energy, like METI, the ministry formerly known as MITI. In combination, all this was a perfect recipe for what's known as a regulatory capture. That is one of the messages we like to convey in this report. Regulatory capture, the phenomenon whereby regulators become too close to those they regulate, which tend to have more expertise in that business. That is a concept extended by Professor George Stigler of University of Chicago, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics for his concept of regulatory capture. In this case, we have total regulatory capture. NISA, Nuclear and Industry Safety Agency, routinely consulted TEPCO before requiring it to make any changes to the plant, which is known to upgrade the safety against, let's say, earthquake, maybe tsunami, and also like flood, and even after Aceh tsunami of 2004, which hit one of the nuclear plants in India. Conceit of the nuclear profession was reinforced by the collective mindset of our government bureaucrats. In a way, my statement may be a bit too harsh, but our Japanese system in practice, the first duty of any bureaucrat is to defend the interest of his organization. And that meant letting nothing stand in the way of nuclear power. This mindset was so strong that it often caused the bureaucracy to neglect their sacred duty to safeguard Japanese citizens. The social dynamics behind the collective mindset that led to Fukushima nuclear accident are not unique to TEPCO or METI. They can be found in workplaces throughout Japan. Reflexive obedience, reluctance to question authority, groupism, insularity, as I told you, and sticking to goals even when it's obvious they are misguided. Those responsible for the accident should be held to account. But to ensure nothing like this ever occurs again, every Japanese should reflect deeply on how this happened. When we see something obviously wrong, we cannot let groupthink prevail over common sense. We must learn to speak out and to question authorities. Admitting the truth to the world is painful for Japanese and for Japan and myself too, but it's therapeutic. Only by exposing the root causes of this accident can we ensure that nothing like this ever happens again. We should share a lesson with the world. And with that, let me turn it over to you, Martin, and I look forward to sharing some thoughts and discussion with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I will turn over to you. First is Anthony, and then I will go down the list.
Anthony Rowe, Singapore Business Times. I'm afraid I haven't had time to read every word of the report yet or the summary, but I understand that you say that the possibility cannot be ruled out that the earthquake itself caused damage. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about why you say that and what evidence there is that that could be the case. And if it is so, does that mean Japan will issue warnings with nuclear reactors that it sells to other earthquake-prone countries, which a number have come to mind?
Right.
That this can happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I think. Sorry, we do not have a English version of full text. I think, but there are a few items I think which strongly suggest of the effect of earthquake rather than tsunami, and I think. When something happens, like tsunami, earthquake, and 50 minutes later, like tsunami of that magnitude, I think you cannot flatly rule out the effect of tsunami because Japan is fairly tsunami-prone, and then we should be very careful to look into the evidence, or perhaps this evidence may be very difficult to obtain at this time because of high radioactivity. But we have to be prudent to assume what could be the effect of tsunami. In fact, I think the so-called back check and why not to reinforce the nuclear plant structure and function under such a massive tsunami, and that have been mandated, look back and reflect and check it in 2006, but somehow this nuclear industry and TEPCO and also METI sort of negotiated the thing and prolonged this back check. But also, I think in reflecting to your question, back check in the U.S. and elsewhere is you have to check it, and if you have a insufficient structure or some functional defect, you have to back fit it. But in Japanese, I think this is just back check is sufficient. It's not true. And so back check is in reality is made in Japan word. We discovered, we write it too. So when you see back check, then you have to have a back fit. So that is a rule in the U.S. and elsewhere. Thank you again.
Carsten?
This means, I think, katakana. When katakana appears, you have to be suspicious.
Carsten Germes, Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung from Germany. You said this accident like this should never appear again. And that Japan, yes, it's made in Japan. So Japan Inc. had its form of responsibility. The day you published your report, the first nuclear reactor in Fukui was restarted. Do you think this is some sort of symbolic? Do you think that Japan Inc. really changed? Do you think there's any chance of changing? Because 1 year after Fukushima, nearly nothing, for my personal opinion, seemed to have changed. What gives you the optimism that things might change, or are you a little bit pessimistic? And do you have any reaction by politicians? Because this is a report to the parliament. Does anybody respond and say, yes, this is a problem, we really should change?
Sure. First, I think I'd like to respond to you. This is a very legitimate question, of course. So that early February, we made a sort of statement that talking about the regulatory agency of this independence under the Ministry of Environment, I think you should wait. This is a government decision. Administrative arm decided it, cabinet, right? But I made a protest because we are commissioned to study that too. As a mandate, I think at least you should not ignore that. So I send a message as a protest to that because they are the part of this parliamentarian. But they ignored it. That would be fine because I think I just conveyed a message. Now, legislative arm have to govern, at least oversee, the administrative arm. That was the message. But I think they just kept going on so that in this OE, I think that's not a part of our mandate, but in April 18th, that's 9th committee meeting. And we made all the committee meeting open to the public on the web, and so just you could watch this thing. And also all my commission meeting has a simultaneous translation into English. And also those who appeared in this session, like the president of TEPCO and CEO of TEPCO, Shimizu-san, and also Prime Minister Khan, and also Edano-san, who was the chief cabinet secretary, and those responsible at that time, we just called upon and made it open to the public, and also that simultaneous English translation, and that's also available on the internet, and they know that. And that is the reason we called upon Mr. Fukano, who is the chief of NISA, that's the Nuclear Industry Safety Agency. So I asked question, what is the criteria for reopening a nuclear plant? And he made list of 30 items, which sort of more responsive to this tsunami disaster and earthquakes. But also I think but the cabinet made a decision, 15 of the 30 is enough. And Prime Minister Noda said, we take a responsibility. I don't know what the responsibility means. So that's a question. But since administrative arm, our government, cabinet went on to this decision, so I'm urging a legislative arm to set this 7 recommendation as a legislative arm to be responsible and try to implement. But to do that, of course, politicians need public support. So that's one reason I'm talking to you to push Japanese public so that our recommendation to the legislative arm will be implemented to monitor and regulate, at least oversee, the nuclear policy.
And how optimistic are you that something will really change?
Well, that is a big challenge. And I think I was surprised to see this was the first such an independent commission by the National Diet. So when this law passed, I privately spoke to some legislators. This is the first time legislative arm really functioned in Japan. But later, just they asked me to chair this thing, which is sort of unexpected thing. But since I was saying this thing, so I had to accept it. So this is a big challenge. But I think I like to make this as a sort of step to change Japan to more functional democracy. To do that, media plays a very important role. Media means not necessarily in Japan, but to the world too.
Hi there, David McNeil for The Economist. Thanks for coming today. The big puzzle, I suppose, for me is the first private commission, the so-called Funabashi Commission, which investigated the accident, concluded that Prime Minister Khan had micromanaged, I think was the term they used, the crisis, which caused problems to get worse. But his decision to confront TEPCO on March the 15th was vital or crucial, they used a word like that, because they concluded that TEPCO was about to pull out the power plant. I was listening to the testimony to your commission, and I think I recall Mr. Khan, Mr. Kaida, and Edano, so 3 people, the sort of main players in the government, none of whom particularly like each other as far as I'm aware, all sort of saying the same thing. It was our understanding that TEPCO was about to pull out of its power plant. So I wonder if you're now saying that the private commission, the Funabashi Commission, made a mistake, that they didn't understand or they didn't have all the evidence, or at least what explains that sort of key difference between you two?
Thank you for your great question. I think since 3/11, there are many books and reports, not only written by Japanese, but many reports and books have been published. And we have not gone through everything because every week new books comes out, but that was very informative. And some reports from like some European country and some US, that was also very informative. But many, some would not agree with their conclusion, but we try to be as much as facts-based and database basis. And I think many are written by based on the hearing of many politicians and responsible person. But when somebody writes without original text or something, that will be very hard to grasp where the facts are, because writer would have some certain intention. So I respect Funabashi-san report, that's fine, but there's many other reports. But at least I think we made a commission, therefore, open to the public and see how they respond. And the way I did that was how forgetful they are in certain things. And I think that is a judgment by you all, because that translation is given into English too. That's the reason we made it public, and I think sometimes people may lie. I mean, who knows? And so that is the thing. That's you to judge.
You have, David, do you have a follow-up, or you look a little bit?
So your conclusion is somebody might use it.
Right. So that I think, I'm sorry just that English translation of full text is not available immediately to you, but I think you might talk to some friend to assist you what record shows and what is the transcript of this. We are inquired to Shimizu-san and also other people. And also there, we went with a log of this telephone conversation, telephone calls from TEPCO to Prime Minister's office, this and that. So I think just we have a certain narrative we have taken from TEPCO's tape recording and videos. And we like to be as much as possible to be facts-based. Thank you for inquiries.
Okay.
Hello, Muir Dickett, the Financial Times. Thank you for coming today. You say in the preface to the English summary, and you said again now, this very tough message that this was a disaster made in Japan, that fundamental causes of it are rooted in Japanese culture, insularism, Gruisism, these things that you say extend far beyond the direct players in this crisis. So my question is, why didn't you say the same things in the Japanese language report?
You asked the same question yesterday, right?
Yeah, I wasn't really persuaded by the answer.
Well, I think, but you read Japanese too?
I do.
Okay, that's great.
Badly?
Yeah. But I think, because I think I worked with some sort of native English-speaking people, like more professional editors and writers, and I think I was very happy on this preface, which is quite different from Japanese, because that's really, because we like to make it short. And also this is not complete, like back-to-back translation of Japanese executive summary, because I think I really addressed this to the global audience. And but the essence of our message, I think it's not so much different, because I'm not addressing this to Japanese, in my view. But I think I'm addressing my Japanese version to Japanese. So that would be different.
It seems strange to me to say to the outside world, this is a Japanese-made crisis.
Yeah.
To say to Japan, this is a man-made crisis. It seems to me quite a different message.
Really? But do you think Japanese would understand if I say it, as it said here?
John Boyd, IEEE Spectrum magazine. In the report, you mentioned that when the earthquake struck, it immediately hit the outside power lines so there was no electricity coming into the plant. However, you also say that the Tohoku Power Company, there was a backup line.
Yes.
And that this was connected to Unit 1.
Right.
However, the problem was that there was a mismatch in the plugs.
Right.
Could you tell us more about this mismatch? What is the technical name for the plugs? And if there had not been a mismatch, does this mean power would have been available to all 3 units? And how would have this prevented the accident from working?
Our fundamental message, I think there are certain technicalities, but I think fundamental message we like to raise is a complete principle of nuclear plant operation and the policy, because this started happening in 1950s in Japan to utilize nuclear power plant, and that time 1955 and late 1950s, that time obviously the gap between Japan and the U.S. in nuclear plant and all the massive technology is quite different. So the first Fukushima plant, before that another one was the Fukushima plant of commercial use was third one, but this was in 97 began operating. That's Mark 1. That's a tanking thing. That means GE just implement everything, and we may watch and learn some of the sort of nuclear plant, and then just give a key, and that was the thing. And all the scientific development for seismology and other things came later, but I think somehow through this, and at that time, Japan started to build a sort of legal system and laws and principle of this and that, where the location of nuclear plant, if you look back around that time, principal acts of nuclear sort of operation, if you see that, obviously the safety of the people is not in it. That is the foundation of Japanese nuclear plant. Also, safety regulation and the impact to the people around this nuclear plant was implemented, just transferred from U.S., but they were modified to fit into the Japanese population because it's not a vast country like U.S., and that was never touched since that time. That is the reason in Part 6 we had to review the entire nuclear policy to change this fundamental law to secondary law, to tertiary law. And in fact, if you see that, but since then, world become more and more different because of connectedness and also transparency and openness, so that everybody begin to see that. And to have an operational nuclear plant, you have 5 layers of defense, so-called defense in depth. That means 1 step and 2 and 3 are nuclear plant itself. But 4th is how you prevent the mitigation in severe accident. And 5th layer is how to evacuate people. And that was not in this basic act of this nuclear law, so that they are not assuming that would happen. And that started maybe 50 years ago. But this fundamental law, what is the principle of this nuclear plant structure and land, was not consistent with the current Japanese system. That is the reason just we went back to the law, and we had to have a completely rebuilding Japanese sort of nuclear plant and also safeguard of the people. And in fact, that is the many trend. And for example, IAEA and they know that, but somehow they resist to implement because that may have a litigation and also maybe an economic reason of the nuclear plant.
But the question was more about, I don't know on which page, I'm not just now looking for it. There was, in your report, you are describing the fact that there was basically a secondary power line.
Yeah,
I know that.
The Tohoku power line couldn't be attached because of a mismatch. And I'm wondering what impact this would have had if it could have been matched.
NHK で使うところで発想がなかったってことなんですけど。
なぜ繋がらなかったこと
そこを繋ごうという発想がなかったんです。
繋がらなかったの、はい、繋がらなかったの。Now, they are not supposed to be connected. That's the reason they could not connect it. And that, why this happens is they assume everything is not this kind of out of on-site events will not happen. And with earthquake, power line was disrupted even before tsunami. And why this was not connected was they are not planning to connect was from Tohoku line. So that's the reason they are not connected.
So if they could have been connected, would there have been power to the 3 units?
Yes, perhaps. I don't know. Because I cannot answer your hypothesis. Because I think number 2 plant, also Onagawa, was almost verge of another meltdown. Very lucky. Also, I think in this full text, we just also went to Onagawa, Fukushima Daini, and that was also almost verge of collapse and meltdown too. Very lucky. Sorry, maybe we have made some comment about this in the full text.
Thank you, Mr. Tateiwa from NHK. Thank you for the interview last night. But those of us, as a gentleman over there, who read Japanese version and the English version, I still kind of feel you probably should talk to the Japanese public about what you convey in an English version, like what you said, like a Japan-made disaster. And I think Japanese public should understand what you mean by this. And that's my first question. And also that if you were not the chair of this panel, do you think the report would be different? And the third question would be that who decided all this? Who designed this? As soon as the report came out, the English version was ready, and this is really rare case, I think, in Japanese those kind of community. And also all this healing was translated in English. And is that you decided or who decided?
Commissioners. We discussed how to run this thing, and how to run it is up to us. Because the commissioners' committee meeting, I think they encouraged to be open and transparent, so we did it. But also we had other inquiries, so that when we make it open, if we make it open in Japanese, I mean, that the audience has become very limited. And this is a time for connectivity. Why not?
I know, but when you say we, is that
Commissioner,
you or?
all the 10 commissioners.
And who proposed it?
I don't know, maybe me, but I think
maybe you, I think you, is it?
Yeah, I like to make it open. When it's make it open, why we have to be only to Japanese in such a connected world?
What about the report in English?
Sure, that's I think we agreed. I think this is so
is it
important.
You or the 10 people?
Yeah, everybody, of course. Why you limit this report only to Japanese? This is a global relevance, no? That is a concern for the rest of the world. Because they like to learn what's happened. Don't you think so?
I think
you don't like it to do that.
I like it.
Just if we do just in Japanese, and is that the way you like it?
No, yes.
Why
I
not?
like the English version, but the question is,
why
also
not?
Would it be different if you were not?
Maybe.
Maybe.
I don't know. But this could be another example to run the committee. Why not Japanese government didn't take any notes on official record of this initial response after 3/11? Why is that? Why Japanese public are not angry about it? How irresponsible they are. Why is that? How about the NHK? How about the media? Why not Japanese media are not angry about it? That is the question. And if the rest of the world become angry, Japanese may become a bit more angry. No?
So that means that you designed to tell the international community first, then
Okay,
that
this
comes
is
to-
not a domestic issue, nuclear is. No, it's a world relevance. They are very concerned. They want to find out what's happening.
So,
No?
The first question would...
this is exactly that's what I wanted to ask. The one question was, why don't you explain more clearly to the Japanese that you think it's a disaster made in Japan?
But also, I think this is addressed to the Japanese parliament. And that is the reason I submitted this parliament and how to make, so that is the reason in the press, I like to have Japanese press to spread out this message to the Japanese so that I think this 7 recommendation will be implemented as fast as possible. And they are rather innocent. And how about the Japanese major media? I really think they have a responsibility to spread what we say to the Japanese. But I think it's at the same time, it's best to spread out the same message to the rest of the world.
Yeah.
No?
The question was, why don't you explain to the Japanese more clearly that you think it's a disaster made in Japan?
Well, I think I don't know. I thought this is much better. I think if you read the Japanese preface, also that has a very clear message to Japanese, ordinary Japanese. In my view, that's sort of, if you say this is maybe our judgment. If you criticize, that's fine. Just let's try to translate what the Japanese preface says, and why don't you try that?
Oh,
that would be fine with
okay,
me.
Maybe
I'm not
the message
protesting
is
this.
the message also for our Japanese friends is
Because not completely back-to-back translation of Japanese executive summary. This is rearranged.
So maybe one message is for the Japanese media to retranslate the English version into Japanese.
Okay, that would be lovely.
Linda Sieg with Reuters. I just also like to follow up on this your explanation of the roots of the disaster in Japanese culture. Mm-hmm. Aren't you concerned if you say it's due to culture, which is something formed over thousands and thousands of years, you can't fix it? If it's an institutional problem, which seems to me that that's what the body of the report is saying, then you can fix it. That's one question. So if it's culture, end of story, isn't it? And secondly, if it's Japanese culture, then how do you explain the people who over years and years and years stood up and said, we have a problem here? Now, they were Japanese, or not. Were they not Japanese?
I know. So I think if you live long enough in Japan, I think there's always Japanese way, and also that the culture. But I think I don't know if I start talking, that's maybe too much, but I think also Japanese use too. Japanese language reflects culture, and that I think one of the difficulty in communication. For example, like Japanese, if you try to do among Japanese telephone conference, do you think it works? No. Why is that? Because Japanese is not logical, and there's so many I's and you to choose. And if you cannot choose the right I and you are not educated well as a Japanese. That's the reason, unless you see the telephone conference, it's very difficult because you have to see the face of your superior or whatever. Then if he looks like not so happy, then you could say at the end, it's not what I think or something, that you could do that all the time. So why you cannot do telephone conference among Japanese? Think about it. But to do that, I think it will become, like or not, I think it's become global. And this kind of business, practice, and education, and governance become more, you like it or not, global. And in fact, even, for example, like many countries like UK, just changed the nuclear regulatory agency in February last year, and the structure, because they changed it under the banner of to health and safety of the people, and the safety and health of people and of environment, something at the banner. They changed the regulatory agency, and that's 1 month ahead of time. And French also has a Nuclear Transparency Act in 2006, and that's a sort of movement of the world. But how to change I think you have to start with your own culture acceptable to the public and also policy makers, because that's a democracy which have become a bit of problematic at the moment. But I think that you really have to understand the psychology. But I think it's very difficult to discuss with you. But I think but I like to convey that message. That is the reason why then. That is the reason I reminded the parliamentarian about this is a Pearl Harbor, because I always ask a question, unless Emperor says we're going to surrender, who ended that war? That was my question. And who takes responsibility for that defeat?
Okay.
So that is a more deep-rooted thing.
But the other question was also about institutions. There's interplay between culture and institution. Is it a cultural thing that in Japan regulators don't really regulate? We had the Anya incident where with earthquake resistant standards in construction industry, where basically the message was, okay, the regulators just rubber stamp blueprints, but they never visit the construction site. Same in other industries, like now the insider trading scandal with Nomura, where regulators, of course, know what's going on, but they really turn a blind eye to it. Is this cultural, or is this institutional? Basically, can Japan maybe learn that regulators have to have more employees, they have to be more independent, they have to be more hands-on. For example, in Germany, a third-party regulator is investigating the nuclear power plants, and 50 engineers are responsible for one plant. And here in Japan, the NISA sits in Tokyo and has basically nobody on the ground.
In fact, I think when we studied the 3 Mile Island report, it looks so similar to the condition we had, which was 30 years ago. But also I visited various institutions like INPO and National Nuclear Regulatory Commissions, and I think over the 30 years, they are not changing very rapidly, but I think they always try to improve the quality and more like transparency to, just more competitive or whatever. I think that was, I think, if you change just structure, I don't think that would really change a regulatory agency. That was the message I think I like to convey. So the Japanese version, I think, like a big company and bureaucracy, why fresh from college, you feel like this is a norm to spend your life in this single-track career in that institution organization. And that was the main message I wrote in Japanese preface, which non-Japanese may not understand. Why is it? That's crazy. But in Japanese, that's a norm. So why this is a norm? That was the question I posed.
Thank you. Khaldun Azari, Panoramic News. You represent and you chair an independent committee. I'm wondering why did the Japanese government establish an independent committee that would come up with such a report criticizing the government itself? Is this the start of the change of Japan to solve the problems, and do you think this should make us feel more confident that there will be no more crises like this in the future? Thank you.
No, I think one of the major points, I think Hatamura report, which is an evaluation committee by the government, I think it will be coming out in a week or so, right? I'm very much looking forward to what it says. Knowing the sort of team members, how they produce. So I think there's a mechanism to check sort of government, administrative one, and check and balance is very important. So I think one of the major missions I think we like to communicate with the Japanese public is this kind of independent investigation, which is not utilizing any civil servants in our team, just a Kokai Gijido's few members to make transaction and request all the things. They have done a wonderful job, although this is the first time. It's very difficult. But I think I'd like to have this kind of process more part of routine inquiry to any major issue facing Japan. And I think I like to make it as one example. So I think legislative arm would appreciate, and through the public support, this kind of thing could become another test case. For example, like back-end thing. What are we going to do? That's one of the recommendations we say. Legislative arm should have an independent such a committee to make some inquiry and recommendation back-end thing, and many other things, social security, pensions, whatever it is, and that includes some sort of world authority into that too. So I think this recommendation and this kind of process, I think I really like to be a part of Japanese sort of government.
Nice to meet you for the first time. Going through the list. My name is Shoda Ushio. I'm a slave for Nucleonics Week of McGraw Hill Companies.
Okay.
My question is concerned over the near future, September and thereafter. Mr. Hosono says he's going to create two great organizations, the Commission and the agency. Should a similar accident occur after September, do you think that these two groups can help prevent a serious natural disaster hits one of the nuclear stations? Do you think these organizations can help prevent a severe accident like that of the Fukushima station?
Oh, you mean Hosono-san's this regulatory agency?
Yeah, Kisei something.
Right.
Sounds like a Japanese copy of the U.S. organization, the Japan Nuclear Regulatory
Agency
Commission.
Right.
Plus, NISA's successor, the agency.
I think we strongly recommend. I think world trend, at least leading company like U.S., U.K., and France. Different culture and different sort of mindset. But I think key issue is that independence. Such agency have an independence and transparency and certain authority as a regulatory agency. And that is a strong pitch by, for example, Richard Mezabe, who was a former chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in the U.S., whom we invited. And that's in session 3, I guess, committee number 3. But I think we make a strong pitch. That has to be a principle, not under certain ministry, because Hosono-san is very good. I really admire what he has done throughout. And he said he's responsible choosing this and that. But when he is not the Ministry of Environment, what's going to happen? It cannot be. It's a more institutionalized, not ministry like somebody individually dependent person. It's not a good organization. It has to be more. It doesn't happen in a day. But through that is the reason continuously to evolve, to improve this institution, to meet the global sort of respect and at least trust by the global community. It doesn't happen in a day or a year or two.
You mentioned...
Have to be striving to improve all the time.
You mentioned 3 key issues: independence, transparency, authority.
Yes.
What about money? The big problem in Japan is that you have all kinds of interesting ideas and institutions, but then they are underfunded and understaffed.
Right. Who makes these policies in Japan? Who makes this policy in Japan? No, but all the ministry. No, most of the policy are developed by administrative arm. No? Each year. So that means each ministry make policy. Do you think they would change their policy to a major way so they cut their numbers of employees? So they always inherit their previous policies. Why administrative arm has only policies, all the policies are made by each ministry? That's one of the major questions. So that is the reason legislative arm has to become more competent into govern your administrative arm. It takes time, but we have to start somewhere. That's my belief. It doesn't change so fast. When Brexit came 150 years ago, they are fighting inside of Japan.
Thank you, Kurokawa-san, for staying with us. I'm Peter Fuchs from Capstone Research. I do financial market research. This is something I can buy in the kiosk. Genpatsu Kikendo worst 50. This is the 50 worst list of this sports magazine, daily afternoon magazine. The public is aware that 50 or more existing reactors are dangerous. My question is, we have also focused on the spent fuel rod pool in reactor 4. But the world has never had 3 contiguous reactors with core meltdown sitting next to each other. Do you feel as a scientist and as after result that we can keep the toxic radioactive stuff sealed or decommissioned over the next 25 years? I'm personally deeply concerned that there will be another oops, but when they open it or it melts or something happens, and this is 1, 2, and 3 are far more dangerous than all of this list because these are still whole.
Yes.
Thank you.
In fact, that is true. I think it was not one of the major mandates to us, but I think every commissioner wrote one sort of paper of their sort of in a letter, not in this version, but in Japanese version, I think. And if you read that, I made that comment because Fukushima remain at a very high risk because not only spent fuel, but fragile structure. And also I quoted the Aceh tsunami because that was December of 2004. But 1 year later, within 6 months, there's another 8.2 or 3 major earthquake in that area, not big tsunami, but also this April, another 8.7 magnitude. So I think Fukushima, it's quite possible to that happen. Then Fukushima is a great risk. And I think that kind of thing has to be communicated through a greater public, not only just ministry. I mean, I'm not so sure they will do that, but I think that is the reason, I think, in this commission, somehow, the process is very important to make policy work.
Would you urge the government to do more to reinforce Fukushima Daiichi?
Yeah.
Is more money and effort needed there?
Well, I like to see that happen, and the government means ministry or the legislative arm. That is the reason that is a sort of priority, to have a legislative arm, to have a regular committee to monitor nuclear policy by the administrative arm. Thank you.
I'm Yuridiki, Financial Times again. A couple of questions, if I might. One is that the other people who've looked at the causes of this crisis have included in their list of targets politicians, particularly politicians who became close to the nuclear industry and who put pressure on the regulatory arms and METI to support the nuclear industry's interests. And I couldn't find in the Chinese version any reference to the role of the Diet or Diet members in creating the environment that allowed this crisis. So I just want to be reassured that that's not because it was the Diet Commission's report. Why didn't you look at that issue? And then secondly, if I might, the other thing that's very clear in your report is that Japan was completely unprepared for a crisis of this kind.
Right.
And for the Prime Minister was facing a situation where the regulatory agencies were incompetent and TEPCO was incompetent. The information he was getting was unreliable and incomplete. And yet you also criticize him for trying to establish more direct lines of communication to the plant. So my question would be, what should he have done?
Well, that is a good question. I think I really wish we worked very hard to publish this full text almost at the same time, but they are still working very hard. And it may take another, I don't know, just pre-reading and everything, maybe 5-6 weeks. And I'd like you to wait for that, and maybe just ask your friend to look into that. Some Japanese friend, to explain Japanese version of full text.
I looked in the
Okay.
Japanese version,
Yeah.
and I don't find any criticism of Diet members.
Right.
Why is that?
No, that's another thing. I think in Japanese version, I think during economic growth from 1960s through 1990s, that was one-party politics, and also during this economic growth, that's an iron triangle, and with including academic community and also media and all the things. So, and why you have to belong to one organization throughout your career in single track. And that was more understandable to Japanese, I think majority Japanese. So I think not pinpointing somebody. So that one party monopolizing sort of this kind of system, political system for 5 decades is also a bit of a crazy thing. But landslide victory, of historical landslide victory for just 16 months later, that happened. That was also a tragic thing. And I have written a few things about political leadership of Democratic Party of Japan in Kometo's journals. And so that's another issue. They are not really prepared to do that, how to work with the government and all the bureaucrats.
But
so I don't want to say that in that kind of report.
Won't you, maybe the question was, were you a bit more maybe cautious because basically the people who gave you the mandate to write it were the people you should have criticized more clearly?
Well, that one thing is we have a sort of charge within 6 months. And this is the first time. That means who is going to work with us full time as a civil servants under this dietary members. I mean, I cannot recruit anybody to do that. I mean, so first almost 2 months, it has a hard time to recruit somebody like him. And with a sort of process of, they never did it, and how to make a security. Nobody is working full time, and the commissioners. So how to make security? And that took 1 month, because everybody uses laptop computers, but is it secure? So just we had to build this thing for 1 month and purchase this thing, another, very complicated things, and that really took a long time for us to establish it. So every commissioner, all the staff have to carry heavy laptop computer, and this is double secured, and all the things, and just then another 2 months. Now we have to start exiting. That means you really have to assemble all the commissioners to just work their investigation and make it to this piece has been a tough work. So if somebody asks, why don't you request extending this thing? And that could be done. But I think we have to focus on few things, not expanding that much. But I recommend to continue such an independent investigation for like back end and this and that. I like to push this process further. Once it become a part of process, maybe 5 or 6 each year, like legislative arm commission certain studies, that would be wonderful, at least to me. 知ってるけどさ。だってこれ国会議員やってるんだから。だから最初のところに書いてあるんだね。
Eric Slavin with Stars and Stripes. Within the report, you mentioned that TEPCO's governance model, their risk management, and their public disclosure all need a lot of work. Among the 1,100 some odd interviews that you did you have any private interviews with people from TEPCO who actually accepted the idea that these types of changes might be needed and were willing to go forward on them?
In the private interviews, they knew.
Well, did you conduct it? Well, I mentioned in the report you mentioned that over 1,100 interviews were conducted. Did you sit down with some of these folks face to face without a big room of people?
Right.
Maybe they told you something a little different than you might have heard.
And also some of those who are invited in the public session, also we have a private interview.
Right.
And their comment is not reviewed so that they would talk more freely.
Right.
But I think not in the public.
Okay. Well, did any of those people, can you maybe paraphrase without attributing these folks? Maybe they made a comment here or there that indicated they might be willing to change their governance model, et cetera, that you mentioned, or?
Yeah, they
or
do,
not?
but how and whether they make any action individually is a very difficult issue, because I think all the social system in Japan somehow based upon permanent employment and seniority based and single track, not encouraging them to go somewhere and change the job. And they talk about it, but how to do it is a question. So that I have been pushing this thing somehow. But all the law, just the labor law and social system has been built upon this 1960s through 1990s, and that is the reason many things happen in the governance of even private companies, in my view.
Okay, so do you have any confidence that this will actually change at TEPCO?
Well, I hope so. Yeah. ちょっと待って。
Richard, please come to the microphone.
Also, not only hearing, but we have access to many documents in TEPCO and also other agencies. But they are not in the public view, of course.
Hello, Richard Lloyd Parry of The Times. Apart from its other strengths, the English version of this report is really exceptionally well written. I can't remember reading a report like it, which is so fluently and well translated, and your preface could go in an English language newspaper as an op-ed, virtually unchanged. So it's disconcerting to realise that the English version and the Japanese version are different. They're not exactly the same. And now I know you've been asked about this, but could you explain in detail how that came about? How is it that your preface ended up different in English from Japanese? And is that going to apply to the later, fuller English translation of the whole report? Are you in fact giving us an English version rather than an English translation?
Right. Full report. Maybe what I'll do is just maybe more like a direct translation of my preface in Japanese version.
How did it come to be different?
No, because I think that's our discussion, and I thought this is for global audience. And if I translate more like Japanese version directly, more or less, the sort of impact maybe I thought different.
But I mean, if you write that this was a disaster made in Japan in English, isn't that something that Japanese are entitled to hear?
So, okay, I translate this into Japanese version and write it somewhere. You could do that too. Why not?
First, David.
David Monet for The Economist again. Sorry, can I just push you a little bit on the previous question I asked you? You hinted that you were privy to recordings or conversations, the telephone conversations, I think, that the Funabashi Commission wasn't. I wonder if you've heard the conversation between President Shimizu and I believe it was Banri Kaida on March the 15th, which was the source of so much dispute. Was he saying that I am telling all these workers to pull out of the power plant, or I'm asking for permission to pull out of the power plant, or was he not saying that? Have you heard that, and is it available, and what was your conclusion?
Let's say, for example, like when we invited Kaida-san, I think that's also open to your listening. And I think, also we had a different also interview by like candidate staff at that time, but I think that was private. So that I think we invited only those who are responsible at that time or the role. And I think if you listen to that, I think maybe just what we wrote based on other like recording and telephone records, all the things, we like to have more like facts-based report. And if you have that context with this, what Kaeda-san and also Chief Cabinet Secretary, and that's how you view that with a report, I think that's your judgment and the public judgment. That's what I thought. Still not answering you.
Did you? Was there a recording of this phone call?
No, not how many phone calls were not connected. And I think other report says many phone calls from TEPCOs, but I think many chief cabinet secretaries, they don't take it or this or that. How you interpret it is another issue. That's only speculation, why they say don't take it or something.
Do you think Bank Kaida's misinterpretation of that call was a problem with Japanese language? Or?
Yes. But also translated into English in this during hearing. Yeah. We do not have a recorder, like telephone recording. We don't have that.
So you have Shimizu-san's word and you have Kaida-san's word.
He tried to reach him many times, and when Kaida-san said when he took this phone call, like this is a third phone call from Shimizu-san in 3-4 days, and so that he stated this, he thought this they would like to retreat everybody, but they are not saying that. But I think they took it somehow.
So it comes down to Shimizu-san's word versus Kaida-san's word. Is that right?
No, that's Kaida-san perceived that is the message. And that, I think, we said miscommunication, risk communication, but we decided not to say that because when we make it katakana, that itself becomes misleading, so that ishi no sotsu o kaita means when something is very important, you have to say, are you, or just you have to keep repeating, or just make it clear. So that, when you read it, I think there's a nuance of what they are in their mind. That is a guess, so just we are not making that much of extension of that sort of fuzzy wording. Because we will or we are not, or it's not clear in Japanese. I mean, that's what it's saying. So I think we decided not to use risk communication in general term. When it says in katakana, it becomes more misleading.
The TEPCO report that came out a few weeks ago, they very strongly suggest that it was the tsunami that was the main reason for all the problems, and they sort of whitewashed the earthquake's impact. However, in your report, you're saying that there's a strong possibility that the earthquake really did damage some of the units. Could you go into a little bit of why you think this? What evidence is there about earthquake damage?
No, what we are saying is there's certain suggestive evidence, maybe 3 or 4, I think we just cited maybe 2 or 3, but we are not saying that is the cause of this major disaster, right? But I think Japan is an earthquake-prone nation, so that you have to not flattening out such a possibility, look into that possibility and examine other plan too, based on that hypothesis. I think if you are engineers or scientists, you are not flattening it's very unlikely. You are not ruling out one factor, like which is a major earthquake. And that was a recommendation. So we try to find out. But at the moment, it's very difficult to get into that plant 1 and plant 2 and examine all the things. But that was not actively done over the last few years by TEPCO. I mean, that's and NISA. And that was a sort of attitude of this regulatory capture, in our view.
Anytime.
Okay, sorry.
Dr. Kurokawa, you were not mad as yesterday. It's good. Yesterday you were very pissed off with the Japanese press. What happened?
What?
Yesterday you were so angry at the Japanese press when they asked you about the timing of the report. Why do you get so mad? So angry?
Yesterday mad?
Angry.
No, I'm not angry.
Yesterday?
No. Was I? About what?
Timing of the report, the presentation.
Timing?
Yeah, why you waited so long to present it before the Prime Minister?
What is the timing of the report? What that means?
The presentation of the report, it was made after the Prime Minister Noda has announced the restarting of OE nuclear plant, and people told you, wow, it was a bit late.
No, I was not angry. That's what cabinet decided. Despite the parliamentary mandate, I think we make recommendations. They knew it, but if they did it, that's their decision by the cabinet, which is the administrative arm. So I made it clear that's administrative arm decision, knowing legislative arm asked this independent commission to make recommendations. So now it's a legislative arm's responsibility to how to take a recommendation. And in fact, they just hastily passed both houses, and that's a responsibility. And I was listening what they say. And I think they would review a recommendation, and they may implement as they see fit into this, not in 3 years, but any time. So I think that many comments was made. But I think why they had to haste this thing, and that was the reason. I was not angry. I mean, this is a different process of different arms of government.
Okay, my serious question now. What are your connections with Shiozaki-san, Matsumoto-san from Minchuto, and Abe Shinzo? And how was
Matsumoto
from Minchuto? No. And Shiozaki and Abe Shinzo, how instrumental were they in the process of elaborating this commission at the parliament?
I don't know, in fact, because I have nothing to do with that. In fact, I think after 3/11, I submitted maybe 2 papers to Prime Minister Kant. And March 19th was the first time, maybe 3-page papers. Under such a crisis, it means I spoke about this about a year ago in this press center, because also Democratic Party invited me to speak about this process, because obviously Japanese government credibility, including science community and media, all the things are falling, and also big industry like Keidanren. So I made a proposition to Kansan. In that kind of major disaster, the rest of the world is worried about this, not only sympathizing it, but worried what happens. And that is the reason I asked Kansan, suggested Kansan to make independent international commission to work on this thing. And this was just before G8 hosted by France, and I know France is very political too, because, but I think at least you should make an announcement. We would like to ask independent international commission to investigate this nuclear thing. But obviously, I think they rather choose to have an independent commission by Hatamura-san, which is a bit different. But I think that's always politics. And then I was also made my presentation when they invited me to make, why not Parliament make such an independent commission on behalf of Japanese government or Japanese people. And I think Shiozaki-san had some, also I knew Shiozaki-san, I heard from somebody, also he went to Washington, just what kind of thing could be done, and I think that motivated him to try to do that. I heard this later from him.
Okay, my last little question is about the reference to, I wanted to ask you the question yesterday, but there were so many anger in the room that I couldn't have it. After the war, the hibakusha got a famous status for the issue which open to compensation and so on. You have recommended here many things about that, mental health, like in Chernobyl and so on. This mental health might have a little problem because we don't know exactly what it means in the future.
Right. Yes.
But as the report from the WHO stipulated in 1957, 58, and 59, as you know. But do you recommend yourself to create a special status for the 150,000 people who are evacuated from Fukushima, some sort of nuclear refugee status or something like this? Refugees or something like that, so that they would have some special compensation like the hibakusha got in Hiroshima. Do you think something that you could, you haven't recommended that?
Any policies? Specific policies?
Special status for these people to open for compensation. You just recommended to have, efficiently address public concerns or try to see about the future case of some sort of radiation exposure and so on.
Right.
I mean, would you think they would have some possibility to have a special status for these 150,000 people who are evacuees today, and who today or in 10 years, after all, to govern, to rule is to plan. Yeah? So do you think these people in the future could have some problems and you should have a legal status for them?
We are not getting into each detailed policies in this report. I think obviously that is a major issue they have to consider. But should I make some recommendation, 1 to 3? I think that was a bit not really we are asked to recommend certain policies.
Okay, Dennis.
Dennis Normal of Science Magazine. I know this question goes beyond the mandate of your commission. You identified a lot of problems that made the Fukushima reactors unsafe. Some of those issues were specific to the Fukushima plant, but a lot of them were really more general issues that affect probably nuclear power plants throughout the country. Can you say, based on what you have seen at Fukushima, that the other nuclear power plants in this country are in a safer condition? Are they more seismically resistant?
No, I think that is the reason. I think we recommend that legislative arm, the Diet, made a standing committee within themselves to continue to monitor this nuclear policy by the government administrative arm, and also make a similar independent commission to address certain specific issues, for example, like back-end issues, maybe Fukushima issues, and also back-check issue and back-fit issues. And in fact, after 3 Mile Island, in response to this recommendation, I think they took certain action, and in fact, nuclear utility group has established INPO, and I think they have created sort of rather very unique structure to each other to sort of compete. It's not open because this is a private company, but the guest is the CEO, and this is funded by nuclear utility companies, but also their data are given to insurance companies. And these are very unique sort of progressing sort of mutual overseeing within utility companies, and also many operators just go through different companies too. There's many sort of innovative way of doing such things. So I think I like many utility companies try to do that or not, I'm not so sure. But I think there's many examples you could learn which may fit much better to the Japanese culture.
Can you stay for another
Sure.
Okay. Last question from the floor.
Dicky again, thank you. Just to come back to the question of Mr. Khan and what he should have done at the time, given that he was getting incomplete and inaccurate information from the bureaucrats and from TEPCO, what should he have done? If he shouldn't have established direct lines of communication to the plant, and he shouldn't have established this ad hoc center with his aides and colleagues at TEPCO's head office, what should he have done? Should he have continued to operate according to the original chain of command?
Well, I do not wish to make a comment. This may be a bit too much, like everybody has a different ideas.
So
if you allow me.
The wrong thing, but we don't know what the right thing.
If somebody else was in that position, how he or she would respond? That was the question, because that has to be more institutionalized.
Okay, before we close, I have one last question from my side. The Hatamura report is due maybe next week. One moment, please. Let's first sort out a few things.
Sorry, one question. The Tohoku and also Tofu line was not connected, was not plugging. That was a battery on the car. But Tohoku line was connectable, but this line was not functioning at that time, according to this report.
Yeah. Maybe later the Japanese question or the Japanese version. Right. So my last question is, the Hatamura report is due.
Yeah.
And you said basically you're looking forward to
yes.
it, knowing who is on the team. Knowing who is on the team, what do you expect from this report?
No, but at least whatever the recommendations they may be, I think majority may agree certain things, majority may not agree certain things. I think there's many reports and books and nice interviews and many publications. So I think I'd like to think something would happen to take forward step. I mean, just we have certain historical things, but I think taking this moment of a major disaster, I really like to see Japan really start to change again. I mean, that's always happens with black ships 170 years ago, and A-bomb of black rain, and now Fukushima hit by black waves, which sort of a chapter contributed in ebook Reconstructing 3/11, and somehow black have to come from outside. I do not watch that happen. Just we have to be more inherently innovative and progressive, and that's what I like to see in Japanese society. That's my wish and hope.
Okay, with this appeal for change in Japan, we will close today's session, and it is our custom, 1 year honorary guest membership. Please come and join us at the bar.
Thank you.
And please, I would like to remind everybody to remain seated until our guest has left.
Thank you. なんだっけ、そうだよね。遠くのはだからケーブルでバッテリーからだよね。ケーブルがケーブルがじゃなかった。そうだよね。これはラインがだ。
Since he's not leaving.
そうか。なんかほぼ壊れてるな。いやいや、そんな怒ってた。いや。But I think it's political.